So my mom's here. She's over there. Hi, Mom. Happy Mother's Day. She loves being front and center. She brought me up so that in a way that I have sensitivity to the people around and the time and the space. And I know it's Mother's Day and a lot of you have plans. So we're covering the Old Testament. And there's 39 books in the Old Testament. I don't know if you know that. It starts with Genesis. It ends with Malachi. It was written over about 1,000 years, about 1500 to 500 BC. And it covers the beginning of time until 400 years before Jesus, and the prophecies prophesied Jesus 400 years. So it covers an immense amount of time. So when I started to write the sermon, I ended up at about 2.5 hours. And I knew my mom wouldn't appreciate that because that's not real sensitive to you. So then I started cutting it down, and I had all these great illustrations for Mother's Day and really tied them well to the Old Testament and had all the Old Testament moms in there and all this stuff. And I had to cut and cut and cut. And then I had a great illustration about not necessarily being a mom, but being a parent, because Gabby just got her driver's license this week. So, like, I'm going through that kind of stuff. And, yeah. Well, you have my sympathy, too. And then I didn't want to share that with you because that would embarrass her too much. So definitely don't go and tell her congratulations on your driver's license. And what I came down to, this is what I want you to hear. You ready? This is it. When it comes to the Old Testament, our faith is not based on a book. It's based on a risen Savior. It's based on the eyewitness accounts of 11 of the closest people and hundreds that followed him because he was a miracle worker when he was alive, and they saw him die, and they hid. They thought it was over. And when they saw him alive again, they went from cowering to courageous. They went from worrying about their next on the cross and dying to death can't even stop me, courageous. What our faith is based on is not a book. It's not the written word. The church exploded in the early centuries, and they didn't have a Bible. They had a bunch of, and they might not have even had a bunch of, they might have had one or not even any, just word of mouth. But they might have had a letter from Paul or a copy of a letter from Peter, or if they were really lucky, they might have had a biography of Jesus' life called by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It wasn't until like 400 years after Jesus was on the scene that they took all of these letters that were circulating and they put them together in something called the Bible. And there were hundreds of thousands of people that heard the eyewitness accounts and believed. Because they recognized that our faith is not based on a book. It's based on the eyewitness accounts of a risen Savior, of a person who was crucified, who died, was buried, and somehow miraculously pulled himself out of the grave and then walked around and taught some more. That's it. What we have in the New Testament is the account of that, and then how we kind of live our lives and figure out how to live our lives with this new command that Jesus gave us. So I had a bunch of illustrations about club mentality. Like, I don't know if you were ever part of a sorority or fraternity in college or a club. Some clubs are more rule-based and bound by borders, right, than others, and I had illustrations about parenting, right? My kids, I have a relationship with my kids, but there are sometimes, as teenagers, more often than not, unfortunately, but sometimes where it's not necessarily the relationship anymore, it's about the rules. So you forego the relationship because you have to have these rules in place. And the Old Testament tells us a lot about that. You have the beginning of Genesis, that's the first book in the Bible, and you have like about 20 chapters, and in those chapters are creation and Noah and the ark and this guy Abraham, and Abraham came on the scene, and God was like, you're faithful, I'm going to bless the nations through you. Go out and look at the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach, and that's that's how many people are going to be blessed. Like, so many people are going to be blessed, and God gave him Isaac, and Isaac was to provide that blessing. And then a little bit later, you end up with Israel. And the Old Testament, a lot of the Old Testament is about Israel, and it becomes about the rules. Now, the rules are in place for relationship, but at some point, I think the religious leaders forgot that the first four commandments are about our relationship with God and how we navigate that. And the last 6 are about our relationship with each other and how we navigate that as people. But the rabbinic tradition, the rabbi, they had 613 laws, and they're all in like Leviticus and Numbers, and that's how, and what it did was it made like a club mentality based on rules. And the religious folks became the rule keepers. But God initiated all that so that there was a seed that was planted to give birth to Jesus, the promised one. So our faith is not based on a book. It's based on a relationship with a risen Savior. It's how we live our lives. And when you I don't know if you experience community this way, but typically communities are broken into boundary restricted areas, right? So you have towns, and you have clubs, and you have all of these things in our society, nation borders and all this, and they're typically designed with a cultural mindset of oneness, so that like you kind of, as U.S. citizens, I grew up here, right? So I kind of understand how the Constitution works and how our society works, and what's right and what's wrong. And sometimes I buy into what's wrong because of my cultural upbringing. But but we have a common experience and a common language. And even within the U.S., I mean, come on, New Jersey is known for a couple of things, right? For better or worse. But here's the thing. Jesus got that. He knew that. And he knew that our rules here in this town, in this state, in this country aren't going to be the same rules that somebody in a different town, in a different nation, on a different continent are going to have. It's going to be a different language. It's just different. And okay, so hang with me for a second. I know something about you that I'm going to say that's true for all of us, and you might not agree with it. But humans are rule breakers. If you give me a rule, I inherently won't want to do it, and I will try my hardest to come up with rationales or sneakiness around it or to get away with it. Psychologically, you can examine that all you want about authority and all that stuff, but the bottom line is we're rule breakers. And if you tell me, thou shalt not steal, and I say that it was an unsolicited borrow for an extended period of time until I got caught, and thus turning it back to the person of the original. That's what we do. Our whole society is based on it. Here's a rule. The legislature makes a rule. The king makes a rule. And then what happens? Someone breaks the rule because it has to be tested in the courts, and then it gets refined. And then someone breaks that rule, and it gets tested again in the courts, and it gets refined. And it's over and over and over and over again. Jesus got that. 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not murder. Well, what is murder anyway? How do you define that? What if it's accidental? Stealing, well, it just landed in my pocket. Yeah, they owed it to me. And they had some fun rules about cattle and colors and what you could eat and all, Jesus got all that. So what we have in the text this morning, the New Testament text about the Old Testament, is that our faith is not based on a book. It's based on a relationship with a risen Savior who loves us. Who loves us. He loves us so much that he promised us that he's going to heaven and he's going to bring us there. He'll come back for us. And that death cannot even hold us. That's how the disciples got so bold. When Jesus died, they were hiding from the Sanhedrin, from the Pharisees, from the Sadducees, from the religious leaders. They were hiding. And when they saw Jesus alive after he was dead, they were going into the temple preaching that he was alive, wanting the Pharisees and Sadducees to come and challenge them because they wanted to testify to the truth. Amazing. That's what our faith is based on. So there's a promise that even death cannot hold us. And there's a commandment. And the commandment that Jesus gives us is the exclamation point on the Old Testament and the Old Testament laws. And it's the new covenant with God. It's how we live. And I'll tell you why he gave us the New Testament, I think, for two reasons. One is that he knew that you and that me, that we're rule breakers. And if he gives us a hard, fast rule, we're going to butt it, and we're going to find ways around it, and we're going to end up in all kinds of craziness. And the second is, he recognized the breadth of the world. and that not everybody understands life and has the same life view as you and me. So what did he say? Love one another as I have loved you. That's it. You know in your heart whether you're loving somebody or whether you're just giving them lip service. You know in your heart, because of how you've been loved by God, how to love other people. And it surpasses boundaries and nations and everything. Our faith isn't based in a book. It's based on a relationship with a risen Savior who's alive today and loves us so much that not even death can conquer us.